Hello, good morning. I want to thank everybody who's part of the Move the Move the Dial, the Move the Dial organization for inviting me here. It's such a privilege to be here. I was just overwhelmed by everything that Mary shared about what's happening in Salesforce, and let's just give her another round of applause because Salesforce is truly it's just truly one of the North Stars within the tech sector. So it is really truly an honor and a privilege to be here, in part because it's very infrequent that you see someone like myself, right? A chubby, middle-aged, mom of two with two invisible disabilities, of East Asian descent, immigrant, talking about diversity and inclusion. There just really aren't people that look like me on stages like this talking about diversity and inclusion. And it's only really been about 8 months since I joined Uber. So I'm sure all of you are thinking, what can you possibly tell us about the Uber diversity journey that will convince us to really believe that Uber is on the right path? And what I've learned in the last 8 months is really there isn't that much that I can share because there is a very healthy and understandable skepticism about our commitment to diversity and inclusion. And really only truly time will tell if our leaders are committed, our workforce is engaged, our managers are supported, and our programs are integrated in the way that we saw Salesforce has really made a lot of progress. So I'm not going to stand up here and implore you, believe that the commitment is there, because I really truly believe that you show and you don't tell. So rather than walking through all the commitments that we've made, the strategy that we've developed, what I thought I'd do instead is share a little bit of what I've learned in the nearly 2 decades that I've been a part of the diversity and inclusion conversation. And yes, you were right. You were right to hear that I've actually been a part of diversity and inclusion for almost the past 2 decades. I began in the diversity and inclusion space before it was a real thing. So my own journey to diversity and inclusion was very straightforward. I started my career like a lot of people who graduate from university but who don't have a really clear path of what they want to become. I went and spent a few years in management consulting. And after a few years in management consulting, I still didn't know what I wanted to become when I grew up. So I went and got my MBA, like a lot of smart people, privileged people do. And it was while I was getting my MBA that I realized, oh my gosh, I will never be successful in business if this is the expectation that's set for me. Because at the time, I was a 26-year-old vegan yoga teacher. In addition to being a management consultant, I was also a vegan yoga teacher. I was a 26-year-old vegan yoga teacher. And everything that I was taught in business school was created assuming that the leader who's going to be sitting there at the table is a 40-year-old white, cis, straight man. And every strategy that I was being taught would not work fundamentally for someone who looked like me at that time. So I said to myself, I got to change this. And that was my journey to diversity and inclusion back in 2001. So what have I learned in those last, 17, 18 years? I'm going to share with you 3 lessons that I've learned. And they're all going to be lessons that you're like, whoa, 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 Bo. I'm not so sure about that. So, and by the way, I'm going to say something to you today that will probably make you uncomfortable and may also piss you off and make you kind of think, okay, I'm not so sure about that woman. So, first lesson that I've learned. Assume that you are racist or sexist or transphobic or homophobic or ageist or Islamophobic or body size shaming or, ableist. Assume those things. And the reason why I say that, and I've already lost all of you, because all of you are like, I don't want to assume that I'm a racist or a sexist or transphobic or homophobic or classist or elitist. I'm a good person, Bo. So I don't want to do that. But here's the really funny thing that I've learned about human psychology, and I try to study quite a bit that comes out of the academic space. Here's the funny thing about human psychology. When we actually assume that we are vulnerable to bias, we are more likely to very intentionally ensure that we are not. Right? Because the basis of human psychology for the vast majority of us is that we assume that we are generally good people. I don't assume that most people are biased or behave in a biased way because they wake up in the morning, they roll over, they turn off their alarm clock and go, today I'm going to be sexist. Today I'm going to make somebody in a wheelchair feel really bad. We don't wake up that way. We wake up, we roll out of bed, and we think, today I'm going to be the best version of myself. Yet that best version of ourselves oftentimes ends up being biased without us ever knowing consciously what that is. So, the good thing, even though we are biased without knowing it, the good thing is that when we cue ourselves to be more conscious of our biases, we actually work much more consciously and proactively to not be biased. Simply saying to yourself, I, as someone who is light-skinned, and I include myself in that because I'm a very light-skinned East Asian woman, I, as a person who is light-skinned, almost certainly have some degree of dark-skin bias that I am not even conscious of. That's how I navigate the world. And because I navigate the world going, as a light-skinned person with light-skin privilege that I will never fully understand, I have to be conscious of how I engage with people with dark skin, because there is a strong dark skin bias in this world. In the same sort of way, if you are a man, if you are a cis, straight male, because society has been built to privilege men, if you navigate this world thinking, as a man, I probably have some sexism that I am not even aware of, you are more likely to consciously work to overcome that sexism when you assess talent and you seek potential. So here's a very simple thing that you can do tomorrow that will actually transform the way that you engage with the world and will transform the way that you are inclusive. When you are seeking talent, when you are engaging with somebody who comes from a background that is not yours, simply you say to yourself, I am vulnerable to bias. What bias might be here, and how do I overcome that? That simple mental, psychological cue will actually make you more inclusive. And this is a really important lesson for the tech sector, because for all of the woes that we have seen over the last few years, all the media attention that there has been around the lack of diversity and inclusion, there is still a fairly strong narrative within the tech sector, and I have experienced it in the last 8 months, that the tech sector is still relatively meritocratic and egalitarian, that we still really truly have the ability to design products for everybody in society. But here's what I've learned in the last 8 months. No sector that loves to write the kind of hagiographies that we write for founders, no sector that mints millionaires and billionaires on the regular can truly be egalitarian and meritocratic. And the more that we within the tech sector say, we are biased, we are hierarchical, the more we will actually work to take down those barriers. So that's my first lesson. My second lesson is stop calling people from historically underrepresented populations diverse people. What does that even mean? When we say, and I'm sure we've all been guilty at some point in time, because I know I've certainly been guilty, of saying, God, we really need to get more diverse people into this pipeline. So when we say diverse people, what we really mean is we need to get a lot more women and brown people and people from lower socioeconomic classes, right? That's what we mean. And we kind of all know that that's the shorthand for what we mean. So you might be asking, well, Bo, even though that language might be a little bit problematic, we all understand what it means. And so what's the problem with using it? And the problem really is that the language of diverse people is very othering, right? Because it assumes that the people who are already well represented within our tech and innovation sector, that they are normative. And the people who are not there are an aberration from that norm, right? Because the thing is, individuals are not diverse. I am actually not diverse if I'm sitting alone in a room. I'm just Bo, right? I am just a 43-year-old chubby mom of two, person with, two invisible disabilities who grew up in the lowest quartile of the socioeconomic ladder, who went to the University of Michigan. Like, that's just who I am. Diversity is not an identity. Diversity is a state of being. And diversity only exists when you have two or more people in a room. And that diversity can exist on almost any level. It can exist on the things that we think about: gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, physical ability, cognitive ability, personality, and so forth and so on. And so when we use the language, we're looking for diverse people, what we actually do is we start to create the foundation for in-group and out-group bias, right? So this is another little exercise that I want all of you to actually do and think. Rather than assuming that you are the norm and that everybody else is a deviation from your norm, how would you navigate this world differently if you lived by the assumption that you are a deviation from everybody else's normal? That you are as weird and strange to me as I clearly am to everybody else in this world. How would you navigate the world differently, assuming that you are a deviation of someone's normal? Now, I have been taught my entire life, from the moment that I landed in the US as an immigrant child, that I am likely going to be a deviation from someone's norm. That is my normal. And I navigate the world based on that. But if you are someone who comes from a background where you've had relative privilege, and that could be of any background, have you really truly ever thought to yourself, I'm a deviation from someone's norm? And I'll share with you a little story. A couple years ago, I had a very senior executive in my last organization. I worked for an insurance company. And insurance is not known to be the most progressive industry in the world, but I had this a leader. He was 50-something, white, male. I knew his background, so I knew he grew up upper class. And he came to me very earnestly and said to me, Bo, I'd really love to engage a bit more in this diversity and inclusion dialogue, but I just don't feel like I fit in, because I don't think of myself as being a very diverse person. And I looked at him, and because I'm quite cheeky at times, and at the time I was 41 years old and pregnant with my second child, I looked at him and I was like, get out of town! What? You mean you're also a 41-year-old pregnant lady? And he kind of, the look of horror in that moment when I called him a pregnant lady, 41-year-old pregnant, was utterly priceless. So he had just like this flash of like utter shock and surprise. But then a second later, he's like, he got it. He understood what he just did in that moment. Because in that moment of calling himself a not very diverse person, he was calling me weird and strange and other. And after that moment, I spent time with him actually helping him to see how diverse and different he was from me and how diverse and different he was from many other people. So part of the second lesson that I've learned over the years is that every single one of us has an amazing story of how we are different from someone else. And the journey to becoming a more inclusive person is to understand and appreciate those differences, right? So that's the second lesson that I'll leave with all of you. And the third lesson that I really want to leave all of you with is probably the most difficult and challenging one. And that is, in this journey of transformation, and I presume that everyone sitting in this room are allies, either willingly or somewhat begrudgingly. But for every single person in this room, if you have not been made at some point in time in your journey to becoming a more inclusive ally and a more inclusive leader, if you have not been made to feel incompetent, wrong, angry, then you're not doing it right. Because in this journey of becoming more inclusive individuals, in this journey of becoming better champions, you will encounter at some point something where your beliefs are simply not right. I've encountered on so many levels, have been told so many times in my 20 plus years of really focusing on this. I have been encountered so many times when I simply did not understand a community the way that my arrogance assumed that I would. I've had Black people tell me, Bo, this is not your space, get out. And I'm like, got it. I got it, okay, great. I've had people, I consider myself an ally to the disability community because simply, I am someone who has 2 disabilities. But I have made many mistakes in the language I use, in the way that I do the work that I do. And I humbly thank every person who has ever made me feel uncomfortable about my own language, my own way of allying. So if you are a leader in a company and you are hiring someone to help lead diversity and inclusion, and that person has never pissed you off, made you feel uncomfortable, straight up told you your attitude is wrong, you're not actually driving transformation. Every chief diversity officer, every director of diversity, every person who is truly driving change will have some point in time in their career thought, oh my God, I'm getting fired. I know I'm getting fired. I should not have said that because now I've really pissed off the CEO. But it's within those moments of discomfort that actually we are making change. Because here's the other thing about diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion is not easy. Because if it was, we wouldn't need this conference. If it was, we wouldn't have to be talking about it. If it was, I wouldn't be having very similar conversations now that I was having in 2001. And by the way, I'm still having a lot of the same conversations I had in 2001 in 2018. If you look around our society, you all are aware that we are deepening the polarization in society. It's not actually getting better. It's actually somewhat pivoting worse. And that's because within North America, and I say this in US and Canada inclusive, we kind of hit, I would say, not perfection, but stability sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. We all sort of agreed, okay, we did that. The civil rights movement happened in the US. The feminist movement happened in the US in the 60s and 70s. We're all kind of exhausted. We know that diversity is the right thing to do. Can we just stop talking about it as a society for a few decades? And that's essentially what we did, starting in the 80s. Millennials were largely taught to not see color, right? Millennials were convinced that feminism won and that there was no more sexism in society, right? And we stopped talking about it as a society. And for about 2 decades, there really wasn't a robust social dialogue about it. And it was actually bad to talk about it. Because, God, why are you so hung up on the past? Why are you so hung up on the history? We're better than that. But I'm convinced that those couple of decades where we stopped talking about it as a society was the reason why we are now here, because we took our eye off the ball. We stopped having those hard conversations. Inclusion and equality has to be intentional. And inclusion and equality will lead to difficult conversations, and it will lead to people being uncomfortable. But it's within those moments of discomfort where progress happens, right? If it was easy, I wouldn't have to be here. If it was easy, none of you would have to be here. So again, if your leaders are not making you uncomfortable, if your leaders are not pushing you to things that you don't want to do, you may not be actually making the progress you think you are making. And now I've depressed all of you. Right? But here's the thing. Here's the happy note that I will actually leave you all with. I have been in the diversity and inclusion space for quite some time before it was ever a thing. I didn't start off in the diversity and inclusion space ever thinking that I would become a chief diversity officer, because chief diversity officers didn't exist when I started. I started in the diversity and inclusion space very selfishly because I was like, how do I craft a world where I make sense? And so it's been an amazing journey these last years, because there is a social dialogue that didn't exist in 2001. There is an awareness that it didn't exist in 2001 when I first started. There are more people having these conversations. There are people using language that I never thought would be the norm. We are talking about things that I never thought before. And not to get overly political, but we had an election down south last night. I'm an American, so I can't help but avoid looking at that. And for the very first time, I'm just so super psyched about this. We're sending our first 2 female Native congresspeople to our House of Representatives. And we are also sending our first 2 female Muslim members to the House of Representatives. And though things are crazy in the US, and though things can get so sometimes infuriating, I look at that and think, that couldn't have happened 10 years ago. That couldn't have happened 20 years. That couldn't have happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. It could only happen now. And that for me is the North Star. And that for me is the progress. And that's what I look at every single day when I think, what's going to inspire me today to make those kinds of progress? Because as Jody said earlier, you can't be what you can't see. And now there are little Muslim girls and little Native girls running around going, I could become a politician, and I could become a congressperson, and maybe a senator, and maybe a president. And that makes me unbelievably happy. So thank you so much for your time, for listening. I want you to all lean into the conversations. I want you to become uncomfortable. I want you to challenge your assumptions about what you are, and that will actually make you more inclusive. Thank you.